Again, and welcome to the second part of this symposium, especially after lunch. So thank you so much for being here. So it's a great pleasure to me to introduce Professor Forrester. He's Professor of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. His best-known work includes planning in the face of power, deliberative practitioner, and dealing with difference. His best teaching cases appear in Planning in the Face of Conflict. His recent article, Our Curious Silence About Kindness in Planning, appears in Planning Theory. With colleagues David Law, Kim Reardon, and Daniela De Leo this year, he has published and assessed practice-focused oral histories, dealing with conflict and improvisation, community building post-Katrina, and contemporary Italian urban planning. Forrester has taught during sabbatics in Israel, Holland, and Italy. He received his bachelor and master degree in mechanical engineering and his Master of City Planning and PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. So now it's time to hear from his presentation entitled How Spaces Become Places, Lessons from Place Markers. Thank you, Professor Forrester. You can start with your presentation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction. Although I'm speaking to you now via Zoom this afternoon, or this morning for me, I'm looking forward very much to spending October actually in Rome as a visiting professor. Today, though, I'd like to explore with you two stories. The first is a bit personal, about a research and teaching strategy that I've developed to study city planning and placemaking practices. I want to begin by telling you enough about my research and teaching methods so that we might learn together about cities and even about changing them. Then the second story is a striking one about race and politics, about power and the politics of expertise, all in the context of food systems planning in the Motor City, Detroit, Michigan. And then finally, we can explore implications and lessons. Now, I offer these stories not so much to entertain you, of course, but instead, like most of the stories we tell one another, to do work, even to change one another's minds. Typically, we tell each other stories to describe and capture something significant, something to reconsider events worth retelling. In doing so, we characterize the actors involved and we set out the dramas of their interactions. We do this with stories just as we listen closely to them to better understand or to clarify cases or examples that we might learn from. Now, I'm about to publish a book with the title of the beginning of our title, How Spaces Become Places. How Spaces Become Places. Placemakers Tell Their Stories. This collection presents 13 detailed accounts, I call them practice stories, emerging from central actors as they have been asked to recall confidentially and candidly complex cases of their own practice and how, step by step, their actual work has developed. Reviewing these accounts, which I have gathered and also then used for many years as teaching materials, we can look through the eyes and at times even imagine being in the shoes of planners and designers, mediators, organizers, consultants, planners broadly, as they have tried to come to grips, as they have faced and struggled practically with pressing urban problems like affordable housing, transportation planning, racial violence, urban design, and more. So I'm interested not only in learning about cities, but in changing cities by examining diverse, grounded, and engaged placemaking practices. My biases clearly then are both ethical and political, scientific and analytic, and pragmatic as well. In cities of pervasive inequality and difference, exclusion and vulnerability, systemic racism, and bewildering complexity and interdependence, we can and should do better. We should walk more humbly and attentively. We should exercise more compassion and intelligence. We should respond more to injustice. So my interests and my students' interests in planning are both scientific, to understand and to explain, and ethical, to respond better to suffering and injustice. I've written about this approach at some length as what's called as a critical pragmatism, because I take the challenge of good research in our fields to advance, to improve planning practices on the ground. At Cornell, I routinely ask my students to bring their scientific readings to life by interviewing and then analyzing the work of urban practitioners, planners, organizers, designers, community activists, in any field of their own interest. I've done these interviews myself most intensively on several sabbaticals in Israel, in Holland, and in 2015 in Rome with my extraordinary Sapienza colleague, Daniela De Leo. The Italian research that we did, Daniela and I, myself, appears in our 2018 book, Reimagining Planning, How Italian Urban Planners Are Changing Planning Practices. But in my classes, students have carried out such projects, such interview projects, producing and analyzing profiles of practitioners for years, and the students have regularly evaluated these projects as some of their most interesting and memorable university experiences. They not only read about pressing planning issues, but they can ask practicing planners how they have actually handled, managed, and responded to difficult problems of timing, access, anger, inequality, power differences, and many other obstacles to making a difference. These students do not only quite traditionally read prepared texts then, but they evoke and they have to listen carefully to spontaneous accounts of complex, contentious work on the ground. In this way, students can discover in part how practitioners have learned on the job, how practitioners have been surprised, how they've discovered new facts that mattered, how they've made mistakes or gained wisdom, how they've reconsidered, processed, or reflected upon the difficulties of their work, and how they've come most recently to understand the sensitivities, knowledge, and skills that this kind of work requires. At times, these interview results, mine or those of my students, have been so revealing that I have assigned them as readings for next year's students. For example, several of our Italian interviews introduce my students every year to the community mapping work of Laura Saia and Giussi Papalardo's in Sicily, and to Marianella Sclavi's organizing of collective intelligence in Milano. In addition, as students learn from carefully gathering these practice stories, as they learn from practitioners' surprises and their accumulating lessons gained from their practices, the students also learn about cities, of course. And just as the students can learn from practitioners, so today we might learn too from both of them. So let me turn now to a striking story that involves not just urban food systems and urban agriculture, the creation of Detroit's Food Policy Council, but also what we can call the politics of expertise, expertise derived in this case from the renowned research university nearby Detroit, the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. A few years ago, Ellie was a planning student at Cornell taking my Introduction to History and Theory of Planning class. Ellie was a bright, devoted, gutsy student wishing to work on urban agriculture and urban food systems. She had studied food systems at the University of Michigan, where she had earned her first degree, and at Cornell, she was studying as a master's student in planning. And she had been delighted at Cornell to hear a lecture given by Malik Yaqini, in a symposium on food policy issues. So she decided to follow that avenue. Ellie wrote in her final paper for my class, I interviewed Malik Yakini, who was the president of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and the founder of the Detroit Food Policy Council, because based on the articles I had read and information from a Google search, he seemed to be a significant leader of food systems planning in Detroit. She says, I got my degree from the University of Michigan, about 45 miles from Detroit, and I always felt captivated by the city and completely disconnected from it too. I saw this assignment to do an interview and analysis of a practitioner of my choice as an opportunity to learn about real policy-based food work and maybe get an internship for next summer in Detroit. Based on Malik's resume, she says, I also thought he might be able to illuminate the somewhat nebulous relationship between planning and food, which had been troubling me for some time. As it turned out, though, I was in for much more than I bargained for. Ellie begins to explain what happened in this way. I went into the interview expecting to hear about the storied evils of big corporate agriculture, the environmental silver bullet of sustainable agriculture, and the community building capabilities of good food even amidst the corruption of Detroit. To be perfectly frank, I also thought Malik would be pleased to speak with me and pleased that I wanted to use my fancy Ivy League education to help his city. Instead, though, I got a sinking feeling in my stomach and some very sweaty palms. He was perfectly kind, but more or less dismissive. He says, she says, the portrait Malik painted of Detroit completely clashed with the ideas I had held. The solutions he envisioned almost exactly opposed those I would have suggested. He never once mentioned sustainability or farmers markets or genetically modified corn, the pillars of so many sustainable agriculture conversations. His priorities were almost completely out of sync with my own. And worst of all, she says, worst of all, he didn't seem to want my help. Ellie was not pleased. She was quite upset, actually. But she had realized that she was learning about much more than urban food systems planning. She continued to introduce her interview and analysis this way. As I think about and reread our interview, it only gets more confusing inside my head. I chose to respond to this experience in a personal narrative, emotional voice, because I feel that my puzzlement and ineptitude characterize the trials of so many people trying to solve problems that they don't truly understand. So, if we're to understand what has actually happened here, we need to turn to Ellie's interview with Malik. What did he say? What did he do? What did he reveal, teach, clarify in talking to Ellie? And what might he teach us as well? So Malik begins his story this way. For about 22 years, I was the principal of an African-centered charter school in Detroit. We developed a food security curriculum and started seriously teaching the students organic gardening. After several years, we created the Shamba Organic Garden Collective with about 20 parents and staff members, and that collective continued to evolve into a citywide organization. In 2006, it was now called the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. Malik goes on to explain that on the basis of that organizing and building of community support, and having established a reputation of trust and respect with city officials as well, these community-based efforts led the Detroit City Council to establish the Detroit Food Policy Council. But Malik also provided a picture of the broader political context of this work. For his young, white city planning student at Cornell, he explains, young white people coming to Detroit, trying to work on this can have a rough time, to tell you the truth. There has been this long history of people coming to Detroit. We have lots and lots and lots of people who have degrees, many from the University of Michigan, who want to come into Detroit to help. While most of these people are well-intentioned, often though, because they have not divested themselves of their white privilege or have not really studied the system of white supremacy, they unconsciously come with an attitude of paternalism or with a missionary attitude. So Malik explains, after people here have seen this happen repeatedly, there is a defensiveness, like, here comes another outsider. He says, even broader than that, for Detroiters, Black Detroiters, and what I'm about to say is often not understood when people study Detroit, and it's a dynamic that if you don't understand, you won't fully know why Detroiters function the way they do. There has been this long history of discord between the city itself and the mostly white suburbs. There has been this long struggle for 50 or 60 years for Black empowerment. There's been this feeling for some time about the mostly white suburbs created largely by the white flight beginning in the 50s and accelerating tremendously, he says, after the 1967 rebellion, that white people in the suburbs want to come back and take Detroit. I've heard this, he says, over the last 30 or 40 years. They're coming back. They're coming back. And now there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that those fears were not unfounded. There's a great deal of gentrification going on. There are incentives being given to professionals, which doesn't necessarily equate to whites, but often does, to move back into the city. Such things have been viewed as continuing efforts to disempower Detroit's African-American community and to enable the white suburbs to regain control and power in the city of Detroit. So he draws out the implications. The question of young whites moving in, who might have good intentions, has to be seen against that background. The political context of the establishment of the Detroit Food Policy Council, then, Malik has told Ellie, is not first of all about environmental sustainability or the power of big agriculture or the controversies of genetically modified organisms and their potentials or risks for food production. That context is racial and historical. It's centrally about power, control, and ownership. Now, how did this relate specifically to Ellie? He goes on, one of the most valuable lessons I've learned, one of the most valuable lessons I've learned, he says, is that people themselves can organize to impact the communities that they live in. This was a bottom-up effort. This is not a food policy council that was started by a university. It wasn't started by a foundation. It wasn't started by big agriculture interests. This was a truly grassroots effort. And so, he argues, we're very concerned about making sure that it maintains that grassroots character and that it's not co-opted by any force. It reaffirmed the power that people have when they step up and do the work and organize themselves. That would be the biggest lesson I've learned. So, what could be problematic here about Malik's working with Ellie? He goes on. There's still the issue of outsiders coming in and telling us where they see a problem. I respond to that by saying, why would you come in and tell us where you see a gap? Why wouldn't you ask where we see a gap? He goes on, that gets at the type of approach we're concerned about. Often, what young whites do is not out of any maliciousness. It's not out of any kind of negative intent. It's cultural conditioning, particularly coming out of universities. It's often to bring the mindset, I come in and see something that other people are not seeing. A better approach, we feel, he goes on, would be to come in and embed yourself in the community and find out what its assets already are. What's already going on? How are the people doing the work? Where do they perceive their gaps? For me, Malik says, That's the difference between coming in and assisting and coming in and trying to direct. Malik gives Ellie a simple but powerful example. Let's say that you said, Malik, why don't you come over and help me clean my house? What if I'd come over and say, sure, you need to move your shoes over there? That's not the approach, the way to do it, he suggests. If I'm coming to assist you, I would say, how can I help you? Where can you use my help the most? That's what we're concerned about. People coming in with humility and recognizing what's already in place. There are strengths in places. It's a matter of not looking at it from the deficit model, instead looking at what the history of building resistance has been and trying to see how you can complement that, how you can fit into that. Malik's material example here has been simple, house cleaning. But Malik's moral point, his moral point, has been complex. The well-intentioned helper risks not being, the well-intentioned helper risks being not humble, but instead arrogant, risks being dismissive of others' important efforts, their strengths, by presuming to know and point out their deficits, their lacks. Malik suggests the disregard and even the disrespect that community members can feel if a presumed helper fails to look at, fails to appreciate, and fails to recognize what the history of building resistance has been. But Malik recognizes the challenges that outsiders face. He tries to explain this to Ellie this way. I think the first thing is developing rapport, relationships. You have to let people know who you are and what your intentions are. That doesn't happen in a week or 2 weeks. It happens from building with people, working with people, talking to people. People getting to know you takes some time, he says. But if you're coming in fresh, there's an automatic level of suspicion based on our history, and those suspicions are not unfounded. So there needs to be training in how people enter communities, how they can do it in a way that is respectful and complements the work that is already going on, as opposed to coming in with a missionary attitude, someone who's coming to save the day. So what did Ellie make of all this? This was her interview. She wrote about the interview then this way. I seem to have stumbled into many of the obvious problems of planning for somebody else's community. I feel that I am foolishly the poster child of misdirected goodwill. I guess I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. But looking back on our readings in the class of Karen Umamoto, Leonie Sandercock, Ken Reardon, Horst Riddle, Mel Weber, I realized they were all talking to me, trying to guide me through the messy bog where Malik dropped me. Ellie begins to put the problem and her problem, and perhaps our problem, this way. The idea that people from within a community are best suited to help it has an obvious counterpoint. People who aren't from there are in big trouble if they want to help. This brings up, she says, the part of my interview that scared me the most. I'm not from Detroit. I want to help Detroit be a better place. I'm young, white, and well-educated. Is there no place for me in this equation? Can I make a difference without having a missionary attitude? Karen Umamoto's work has impressed Ellie enough to quote her. For communities that have faced oppressive or discriminatory treatment and feel they have done so due to their racial or ethnic identification, the memory of past experiences is often saddled with ambivalence toward those whom they identify with the dominant group. So Ellie understands and gets it. She says, in Detroit, it seems that my race, and I suppose my class, will initially inform people's perceptions of me more so than anything else. Race and class will initially inform others' perceptions of her, she realizes. But what then? So she presses on. Malik did give me a few hints about what I can do to be accepted, though I had to move past the fact that he didn't happily welcome me. I guess that makes perfect sense based on the history, especially considering the seemingly systematic seeking of power by white people from outside the city. Ellie's experience here is instructive in two ways. We learn first of her immediate personal sense of engaging a community leader whom she had hoped to be useful to and with whom she had hoped to collaborate. That experience has been quite upsetting. But second, she tells us that she then really tried to understand what had happened, to go a little deeper, she says. And here we see that she has reframed her earlier expectations, her earlier working theory of community engagement, and she seems to have learned a good deal. And if we're listening, we can learn with her. So let's consider both the personal as well as the more systemic aspects of her experience. Of the personal, she writes, "This is probably not politically correct, but it bothers me that I felt judged. What did I do wrong?" Then she writes, "But I guess it makes sense. I appear to be what I am, a highly idealistic, highly motivated, and pretty naive white girl with a lot of ideas and a lot of energy. It also doesn't seem to help that I went to the nearby University of Michigan, but I can't get rid of that. And I don't like the feeling that I have to apologize for it. And my feeling victimized by history isn't going to help anything. I guess this is what discrimination feels like. So what do I do?" Ellie went on, "After I had sunk myself into a confused, frustrated mess over the no's that I got, I went a little deeper." Here she draws out the systemic implications, as she says, "There were powerful tools and insights in the interview, even more important than what had scared me so much when I was starting to panic that I wasn't going to get this man to congratulate me on my cleverness and my goodness. I had said to him," she says, "what if I were to come to Detroit to do work and I recognized a hole?" And he stopped me and he said to me, "Let's say that you said, 'Malik, would you come and help me clean my house?' What if I'd come and say, 'Sure, you need to move your shoes over there'? That's not the approach if I'm coming to assist you. I would say, 'How can I help you? Where can you use my help the most?'" So Ellie draws out the moral and the political implications here. She writes, "Well, wouldn't you know it? I had walked directly into my own stereotype. No wonder he didn't thank me for my interest. I fell victim to that treacherously worn-in way of thinking that I somehow know better. That I somehow know better." She now says, "What Malik sees is that it doesn't really matter what I think would help at first. It matters that the people who live in Detroit, the people who really own it, should get to make decisions. Maybe if I'm careful and genuine and generous, they will accept my help. But there is so much more to it than me just wanting to help, more to it than my unwavering commitment to helping." So Ellie has reformulated the political, moral, and practical problem of working in communities from which she has not come herself. She understands now that her caring responsiveness, her help, will always be understood in a historical context of power relationships involving race and class. She understands that her intellectual birthright, the fact that she will have university degrees from Michigan and Cornell, actually threatens to blind her even more than it promises to impress community members with whom she wishes to work. She has become less self-contained and autonomous, coming with her good intentions and expertise, and she has become more humble, connected, and responsive, recognizing that she needs to learn about this new context, the history of community members' accomplishments, the felt vulnerabilities and needs and interests of the community members whose collaboration and respect she desires. She has decentered her world from that of a university-trained expert to that of a potential partner working with a struggling community, with hopes and needs, and with its own fears and possibilities. Right? Decentered herself from the world of an expert alone, an autonomous expert, to a potential partner with a community. So let's consider what we can learn if we allow ourselves to be students along with Ellie, as she has reflected on this interaction with this co-founder of the Detroit Food Policy Council, this longtime activist with the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, Malik Kikini. First, we see most obviously that urban inequality and diversity take many forms: racial, economic, political, gendered, and even epistemological. We see not only difference in who knows what, but differences among the many forms of that knowledge can take: the traditionally scientific, local and historical, personal and experiential. Second, we see that urban history involves far more than chronology, far more than a sequence of events, for it shapes the identities and losses, the hopes and the fears of urban residents. Ellie learns from Malik that without understanding how she is stepping into a stream of urban history, of racial struggles for self-determination, she may well have no one to work with. She can seem not knowledgeable, but clueless, not informed, but ignorant, or worse. Third, then, we confirm the planning truism that so-called problems must first be constructed before they can be solved. They are not simply given as if brute and innocent facts that spoke for themselves. But beyond that truism, the news here might be that the use of expertise in urban contexts differs radically from its problem solving in the classroom. Urban residents may well greet experts with as much suspicion as respect. Residents may suspect that experts can solve the wrong problems, the problems that their limited data informs, not the problems that the residents wish to resolve. Fourth, we learn with Ellie that universities are organizations that foster or reproduce a certain kind of bias. Graduates may walk into the world with not only a sense of their accomplishments in examinations, but with an accompanying sense, then, not of humility, but of presumptuousness, a sense of knowing better, as they have been apparently trained to do. Fifth, though, because nature is not organized the way universities are, and technical disciplines can easily be politically and historically agnostic, if not blind. University graduates are eager to solve problems, to fill gaps and remedy deficits, can easily be dismissive of community members' histories of accomplishments. But when an outsider dismisses your history, of course, you will be less likely to welcome them than to resent them, as you may well feel disrespected, if not humiliated. Sixth, we might learn, as Ellie has learned, that the use of expertise in community settings can depend not just on what she knows about technical problems, but on how she respects and builds relationships and partnerships with the people she hopes to work with, the people she had hoped to help. And this, as Malik suggests, takes time and patience, humility, and listening astutely. Seventh, we can see that even rational scientific problem solving can be politically selective and intrusive. If our sense of rationality is narrowed to the social engineering of technical problem solving, if it does not encompass, but instead dismisses issues of respect and dignity, compassion and doing others justice, mayhem may result, preempting and undermining any sense of welcoming and collaborative partnerships. So I have told you two stories here. one about how we might learn from first-person voice accounts of placemaking urban practitioners, and one about the difficulties, but also about the opportunities of the uses of expertise in university-community relationships. I look forward to your comments and your questions, and to seeing some of you in person in Rome in October. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to share this material with you. So, there we are.
Thank you, Professor Forrester. Thanks again for your very inspiring talk. So now we would like to present the group, so the working group, and if you agree, we can postpone our session for questions and reply after the work presentation, okay? Okay. So now it's time to introduce the second group from the team Innovation, Resources and Development. Here we have Cristian Laurini, Francesco Cianfrocca, Cosimo Francesco Riccio, and Valerio Massimo Camagliani. So we can start with the PowerPoint, please.
Is it visible?
Not yet.
Not yet.
It's saying, okay, is it visible now?
Okay,
No.
now here we have, okay. Okay, so please, when you are ready, you can start. I recommend to the students to stay within the 30 minutes schedule, okay? Cristian Laurini is the first, I think. So you can start, Cristian. Cristian, ci senti? Okay, so we are, maybe we can contact Cristian. Okay, so sorry for the delay. This is the bello della diretta. Okay, so Christian is out of line, but Francesco can start with the presentation. Okay, so thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that was just an introduction, so we can jump directly to the main part of the presentation. That's not
Yes,
the problem.
please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So, how large is a city? This is our main question, and this is going to deal with searching for valid indicators of city boundaries and with a critical evaluation of the SDG indicator 11.3.1. In fact, our work starts with the SDG 11. But what is the SDG and what is in general? What is the SDG 11 and what is in general an SDG? SDG means Sustainable Development Goal. There are 17 of them, and they were proposed by the United Nations in 2015 for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. They were adopted by all the member states of United Nations, and they demand the transformation of the financial, economic, and political systems that govern our society today, in order to guarantee the human rights of all. The 11th goal directly aims to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. It consists of 10 targets measured by 15 indicators, and we chose to analyze the 11.3.1, which measures the ratio of land consumption rate to population growth rate. So we found a crucial problem in the definition of the indicator, since in order to measure land consumption or population growth, it is required a definition of a city boundary. But our question is it always the administrative definition the best one? Our answer was no, and so we decided to deepen the issue. We decided to take a different approach. We started looking for a new definition that would be dynamical and that would take into account the different effects the city has on the environment. Our analysis of the indicator started with a part of information. In fact, we followed different seminars held by Dr. Ferruzza from ISTAT, Professor Munafo from ISPRA, Professor Brovelli from Politecnico di Milano, and Professor Nascetti from KTH of Stockholm, that explained us about the state of the art about the topic and gave us the basis for our successive work. So we identified different selected trackers of city boundaries, and specifically we chose to analyze 3 of them. We collected the necessary data, and then using the software QGIS, we manipulated them in order to test our approach on 2 case studies. We selected the case studies of Rome and Turin since they have different characteristics such as geographical position, expected size, or history. We selected and collected 3 kinds of data: broadband coverage maps by Agicom, which is the Agenzia per le Garanzie nelle Comunicazioni, Autorità per le Garanzie nelle Comunicazioni, remotely sensed lights at night by the NASA Black Marble project, and maps of particulate matter detected by the Sentinel-5P satellite that we collected thanks to the platform Google Earth Engine. Thanks to the manipulation of this data, we were eventually able to track some city boundaries. Here, for example, this is the case of the broadband coverage maps. We detected the boundary using clustering algorithms or minimal geometry algorithms on the collected georeferenced data. Instead, in the next one, we can see we used a different technique and we track the boundaries using the analysis, making an analysis of the level curves of the picture provided by NASA's Black Marble project. Anyway, we still not consider our work as definitive, since clearly all the data we collected have pros and cons. And in this direction, we want to present specifically the case of the particulate matter maps. In fact, we concluded that it is probably impossible to define an objective boundary for cities just using satellite maps of atmospheric particulates. Here we present the case of the maps dealing with the NO2 concentration, which, for example, is a selective tracker for vehicular traffic. And we found two main problems. First of all, of course, there could be other sources of atmospheric particulates that are not really related to city life. If we consider here on the right the city of Taranto, we do not expect to see high values of particulate matter, since Taranto is not really considered a big city. Instead, the industries built in the city influence noticeably their values, and we train these level curves that you can see here. But another very important problem is that of concentration, the concentration values for the different pollutants vary significantly due to time and weather conditions. If you observe carefully here on the left some annual maps of concentration values of NO2 for the city of Turin, we can notice that although we can imagine the shape of the city just looking at these images, as these maps, it becomes quite difficult to define a precise boundary. We can go to the next slide. In fact, the temporal variability problem is evident in seasonal maps of NO2 concentration of Rome. On the left we have maps for the 2019 winter, and on the right for the summer. Now, during the winter, Rome presents a stress phenomenon of thermal inversion that causes atmospherical stability and consequently an accumulation of pollutants in the lower layer of the atmosphere. And moreover, the wind of tramontane tends to extend the clouds of particulate matter toward the sea, and so we observe these level curves. Instead, in the summer period, which is characterized by vertical movements of air masses that carry the pollutants in the high part of the atmosphere, we have lower concentrations and more limited and circumscribed level curves than in winter that we can observe here on the right. So, a way to solve the issues related to the satellite maps deals with the use of new instruments to measure values of particulate matter. One example is the use of new high-resolution samplers fixed to the ground. In fact, these samplers allow the analysis of solid particles, which are less subject to variability, and the testing of dozens of different pollutants. A sampler costs around 1,000 euros. It can be placed on street lamps, bus stations, or balconies. The maps that can be obtained have a resolution up to 500 times 500 meters, that is higher than before, and are less subject to variability. In fact, on the right, we can observe as an example a concentration map for the city of Terni. As we can see, the level curves are not affected by the presence of other sources of pollutants next to the city. In fact, if you observe carefully immediately on the right, there is a steelworks, but this not affects in any way the measures, in contrast with the example of Taranto that we saw before. So for now, these samplers are used only in research, but their use in a sustainable city can be opted for. So eventually, we propose some possible developments. We want to use our city boundaries to compute the indicator and then compare the values with those obtained with the current definition. Then different possibilities are, for example, to validate our estimates through a citizen science approach, asking directly to the citizens if they see how the city is evolving. Another possibility is to include other significant parameters in our analysis, but most importantly, we would like to make the population aware of the importance of SDGs and of a proper usage of soil. Thank you very much for your attention. I will let the floor to my colleague, who is going to talk about health and city.
Sorry. So now we will discuss about health and social inequalities. However, our work is in a certain way connected with the previous one. In fact, the previous group, the group of Francesco, tried to define new urban limits, going over the pure definition of borders, and we decided to define new borders of cities in function of healthcare, and in particular we wanted to answer how inequalities linked to healthcare access sometimes can separate territories even though they belong to the same city. We focused in particular to the case of Rome, and here on the right part of the slide you can see the map of Rome, and in particular the map of healthcare centers distribution in the city, the number of facilities every 1,000 citizens. And so by just first look, it's particularly evident that the center has a higher density number of facilities compared to the periphery. As we can see in the next slide, we tried to define more in general what are the elements that prevent an easy access for the population to the medical treatment. So the elements that result in health inequalities. And so we have found not only physical elements, physical barriers, but also social ones. And we have defined three aspects, three problems. So first of all, the quality of life, which is lower in peripheries, affects obviously also life expectancy and health in general. Then we focused on cultural barriers, because low schooling can limit the interaction between culturally disadvantaged people and the world of doctors and medicine. And finally, we considered the problem of location. As we have just seen in the case of Rome, peripheries are often far from infrastructure in general, and in particular in our case from healthcare facilities. So now we can deal more fully with each one of these aspects. So in the next slide we can talk about quality of life in peripheries, and in particular we focused on the study cited in this slide that was again about Rome, and in particular the researchers of this study analyzed some mortality record, some mortality data recorded in Rome, and in particular relative linked to some urban areas on the northwestern outskirts of Rome, and has emerged a close correlation between mortality rates and levels of disadvantage and social exclusion. In particular, we can see on the right a graph that compares the age standardized mortality rates of the more socially marginal areas in green, and instead the ones of the less disadvantaged areas in black that are from the same, that represent anyway the urban areas from the same municipalities. Now we can talk about cultural barriers, and so we can say that the first and most obvious of these barriers is represented by language. It's known that lexicon of medicine is vast and complex with its all technicalities and sought after origin terms that translate the patient experience in house-sounding and strange formulas. So that can lead to a lack of understanding between the two sides, and in particular to a lack of trust on the part of the patients, and in the end this kind of situation spoils the health of the patient, of course. As regards the third point, we have considered these two studies that analyzed the morbidity and mortality rates in the case of patients that came from rural areas or urban ones, but from peripheries. And what has been found is that the mortality and morbidity rates are higher in the case of these cases. So again, peripheries and isolated areas are far from healthcare services that are really important in case of acute events like stroke and coronary heart disease. So we have also considered the possible solution to overcome these health inequalities, and in particular we considered the experience of USCA that are special units. It stands for Unità Speciali di Assistenza Continua, that were born last year at the beginning of the pandemic, so on March the 9th, and they were supposed to provide continuous assistance to the patients affected by COVID-19. However, once the peak of the pandemic was over in the last months, USCA could reinvent themselves to, for example, to provide also vaccine to those who couldn't exit from their dwellings. So we speculated that USCA can represent a potential tool to fill the gaps that we've seen from the national health system of Italy and the territory. So in a way to support the territorial medicine. And in the next slide we can see some examples of possible application of USCA. They could deal with chronic disease management. They could control the spread of seasonal flu, as we have seen also for in a similar way for the pandemic by SARS-CoV-2, and we can also think about the possibility to boost in this way territory-based research. So we can say that USCA represents could represent an important solution to solve almost in part the problems of the Italian national health system. So now I yield the floor to Valerio.
So now we are going to see how technology can be used to improve social equality. The concept of smart city has gone a long way into our imagination and is defined as an effective integration of physical, digital, and human system in the built environment to deliver a sustainable, prosperous, and inclusive future to its citizens. However, most of the smart city project in the years failed to a major problem with its strategy. This technology myopia leads to a lack of citizen involvement. Many smart cities initiatives have ended up as technology demonstration without people engagement. So we are trying to discover a new concept of a future city called cyber city. Cyber cities are substantially open and adaptive systems based on computer networks and urban information resources, which form a virtual digital space for a city. The difference between smart and cyber city is that the cyber city is essentially a smart city's virtual counterpart. In our work, we try to undermine the technocentric approach that technology solves problems by itself, and examine tools that the cyber city can use to encourage citizen participation towards important decisions. Our question is whether cyber cities technology may help to overcome the limitations of actual participatory practices. And these are defined as political and social strategies that enable citizens to participate in decisions about specific issues, expressing preference, proposing solutions, and collaborating with institutions. However, these practices are affected by several critical points, from the lack of pace, time, and funds, to the difficulty to tackle technical issues. There are, in the present day, several attempts to employ technology in this field, such as e-participation. However, we focused on an interesting proposal put forward in the last years, the use of digital twins. An urban digital twins is a virtual 3D model of a city. It allows city planners to predict, simulate, and visualize what-if scenarios and take urban decisions by collecting real-time data through the tools of Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, extended reality, as well as more traditional technologies. The aim is to create a bidirectional information exchange between the physical and the virtual system. Urban digital twins have the potential to tackle and help solve major issues with citizen participation in urban planning, including accessibility, inclusivity, information transparency, and, for example, creating simulations of scenarios and proposals, allowing citizens to have a more aware participation. We took as a case of study an experiment held in Heidelberg, Germany in 2019, where an urban digital twin was built with the very aim to test its possible application to participatory practices. The digital twin included several layers of information of different natures, all embodied in a single interactive visualization environment rendered in virtual and augmented reality. Although the study wasn't able to test it in a real participatory process, a survey submitted to a sample of citizens showed that the majority believed that it would have a positive effect. Clearly, the study doesn't provide a definite answer to the question of digital twins application to participatory practices, and many challenges are open. The necessary technology and data availability are not widespread enough, and furthermore, it's not clear whether their effect would be totally positive or there are possible some side effects. Furthermore, according to Edelman Trust Barometer Survey of 2020, more than 60% of population shares some kind of mistrust toward technology. And since the data shows that only waiting does not improve the situation, surprisingly, in world-leading countries, the faith in technology is actually dropping. The only solution would be, as shown in the study, to clearly communicate the pros and cons of this technology, to overthrow misinformation and the widespread fear of this technological advancement. However, we should keep in mind that the aim of technological progress isn't a blind faith in technology. We should rather see whether technological progress really improves life conditions. As for city life, the benefits we expect technology to bring may concern the citizens, may concern, for example, citizen participation in public debate and decision-making. If we think of a cyber city as marked by an increasingly pervading virtual communication and virtual social interaction and dialogue, then maybe a cyber city isn't very likely to have the ability to solve problems concerning citizen participation. In fact, the success and effectivity of participatory process depends on many factors, not only on the technological approach to the process itself. Human relation, interest in public debates, and public issues, empathy and knowledge are essential element of citizen participation in a deliberative process. And these are aspects one cultivates every day, and there is no technological magic wand to solve this kind of problem. Since there is a problem with the last speaker, I'm going to conclude the presentation. Thank you all for the attention, and we will be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you. Giovanni now is doing just a brief conclusion.
Thank you. So yes, only to add one final consideration to our work. we could say that cities often relate to progress, depending on both the overall attitude of its members and the particular mindset of each of its classes. Such tendency can result in decisions regarding innovation that are based on character more than evidence, as if the decision-making process were subject to a form of bias, somewhat intrinsic to a city's structure and social composition. This can both define a city's identity, expressed through the decisions of its inhabitants, and impair its relationship with progress, as it contributes to an uneven distribution of its knowledge and benefits. This provides a further explanation as to why we must study the concepts of innovation, resources, and development in cities much more closely from now on, so as to prevent any more delays in future urban growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you to all the students, and congratulations for your job, and also for being ready in front of technical problems. It can happen, especially in a blended presentation, so thank you so much, and congratulations for your hard work. Okay, so now it's time for questions, so I open the discussion for all that are in the physical room and in the virtual room. We can open the discussion. Is there any question for Professor John Forrester? And Professor John Forrester has any question for the students?
Let me say a word or two. I was struck by the ambitiousness of the student work. It was quite extraordinary. And I mean, one of the things we see is the developments of different ways of thinking about mapping technologies, from the most technical to, anticipating the urban twins is a fabulous, interesting idea of the virtual 3D replica. And in each case, I mean, there's a question of what the relationships are between the research and urban residents. It's the most explicit, I think, in the last couple of talks. I bring up one issue, and I'm not sure how it might be helpful, but if you begin with not the problems, sort of figuring out how to solve a problem, but if you think, well, our problem is somehow engagement with the city and engagement with residents. And then in that engagement, we will try to figure out what to do, where boundaries should be, how healthcare is delivered, and thinking about the very rich idea of what if scenarios. So wonderfully important. If you think that we have not only problems of knowing, but also they're integrated with problems of doing. It suggests that part of what we're always involved in is some form of improvisation, of improvising, not following a given script, but improvising in a unique and changing circumstance, in which we find ourselves knowing and acting with others. And in trying to work on this problem of how planners improvise, it seemed that there are three distinct problems, quite fundamental across fields that always arise in improvisation. And very quickly, the three problems are: first, judgments of value or significance. What matters? You know, what is it at hand that we are responding to that has significance? What matters? A. B, different question is, what do we know about what matters? Right? The first is a question of ethics and valuation and significance. The second is our traditional scientific questions. What do we know about this? But there's a third question. The third question is, what can we do? What if this? What if that? What are the possibilities? And my argument for the significance of these three questions goes as follows. If we ignore the first, we solve the wrong problem. If we ignore the second, we are inept, we're stupid, we don't have good information. If we ignore the third, we talk, write report, and we do nothing. So there is a triad of significance, knowledge, action that comes up, and you see them in different ways across these presentations. But I would just like to comment again. I think the combination of ambitiousness and nuance of the presentations were very interesting. Thank you. So I have just bought time for the audience so that now many other people should have questions about either the student presentations or certainly the things that I brought up. So, thank you.
Okay, so yes, please. There is Vittorio.
I have a question for the professor. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for your talk because many parts of it were really enlightening and convincing. For example, the necessity for someone who is coming from outside the community to understand the point of view of the residents and to better understand what are the real necessities and problems that has to be resolved. But I have a question because there's some parts of it that I really struggle to understand. And I think part of it comes from the fact that here in Italy, the question of race, the racial issue is really different for historical and even ethnical reason, I would say. For example, in the talk by my colleagues, there was a big part that concerned social inequality, while during your speech, a big part of your speech was based around racial inequality, and you spoke frequently about white privilege and racial issues. And sometimes I really struggle to understand why this has to be brought up, and is not more relevant. Is social inequality and economical inequality more relevant than racial inequality? For example, I didn't really understand when you were talking about the problem of white residents moving from the suburbs back into the city, as there was a plan to take power from the Afro-American community. And at the same time, you were saying that obviously most of the time they had good intentions and there wasn't really a plan about it. So I'm sorry, maybe I wasn't able to explain myself because my English level is not as good as I wish it was, but I really want to understand better if it's really a question of racial inequality or if the problems of social and economic inequalities is the major problem here, is the thing we should concentrate about. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. There are huge debates about the relative significance of race and class and other forms of inequality, and I would be the first to say that depending on region, territory, and so on, that this is variable. So I'm not making a strict hierarchy there, but I'm using this example. We could put race aside, which I don't want to do, and we could think about the north of Italy and the south of Italy, and the suspicion of someone shows up from the Politecnico in Milano and they show up south of Naples. They're not going to be greeted the way other people will be greeted if, who knows, if they come from Catania or they come from the south. So the force of the lecture, I think, was not so much about race, but about problems, of course, about insider-outsider, about not only qualities of understanding, but about the ironic power of the university. There is a way in which the university can blind us as well as inform us. And, we come out of the university proud of our degrees and so on. And you see in a poignant way in Ellie's case, she wants to help. She studies the problem. She is going to have these degrees, and she runs into this guy who doesn't first want her help. He first wants her respect. He wants her to listen, to learn. And so she has been almost set up by the universities, not to fail, but to miss the problem, to miss all sorts of things. Now, you can make this simple. You say, well, of course, anybody should go and listen. Well, but part of the power of the story, I think, is we see the ways that there are institutional and social forces that predispose people either not to listen or to be arrogant or to be presumptuous, or from the residents, predispose people to be suspicious. So Ellie realizes that just her showing up, so it could be just her showing up from Milan in the south, will make her suspect. Will lead people already to treat her with trepidation that she doesn't deserve. She feels judged. She says, what did I do wrong? So I use the example not to generalize about race everywhere. In Detroit, clearly there is this deep racial history of white flight, of unbelievable systemic racism in land values and sales. But so so I guess I'm asking everybody not to take the story so quite, not literally, but suggestively about what are the ways in other places that similar kinds of forms of inequality and forms of identity lead people to be either suspect or ignorant, or what kinds of training blind us. So let me stop there, see if there are other questions. Thank you very much for it's a very good question.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vittorio. Now there is still time for a brief question.
Well, could I ask a question of the last
Yes, please.
group then?
Yes, sure.
Could you say, is there a little more you can say about how we might explore the what if question in virtual 3D replicas? What if is a wonderfully important question. I mean, it raises the question of how it is we explore possibility, right? Which always is virtual, right? I mean, we think about what if this, that. So you walk out of your house and you wonder which way to go. What if I go here? What if I go there? It's already an exercise in some virtuality, but what the 3D replicas are, fascinating. So what might you say more about how we could explore what if scenarios?
Please, yeah. Yes, there is a student that is coming. Yeah.
And actually, our idea in talking about 3D replicas, particularly digital twins, was born from a contrast with another case study that we took from our studies. That was that of participation process in Genova. That was taken in 2009 about the construction of an highway. And actually, I was struck personally about the difficulty to communicate to people the complexities of the problem. Actually, what struck me was the representation of the problem that was given to people. And the idea is that digital twins could enable people to access information in a more efficient way. Because they can create different layers of information that are taken from reality. So we have real-time data on one end. We have simulations that come obviously from real-time data. And then we can use all this information to simulate future scenarios. And actually this enables people in our mind to be more aware of what will be the consequences of the choices in the participation process, and so to also are more engaged in the process. And obviously, we don't have to think that 3D replicas must be an exact copy of the reality, because actually that wouldn't be useful, because we must have a model that is simplified with respect to the reality in order to be able to understand and to comprehend better that. And so actually the digital twin idea is to take the best information from the reality and put them together and make them interact to give the best picture in order that people could actually take better decisions. So, if I answered your question.
There was a combination of sound quality problem, but I think it's an enormously complex but enormously important problem. So anybody who could work on how better to explore the virtual what-if scenarios, that's a hugely important problem. I urge you to do it. I'd love to find out more about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Forrester. Your talk stimulated a very good discussion with the students. Thank you so much. So we want to warmly thanks to you and all the audience, all the students. Now it's time to close this session, unless there is another brief question.
Well, so if we have another second, I should show.
Yes, we can see. Okay, thank you.
With Daniela, yes. The artist, of course, is Paul Klee.
That's a good advice. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all.
No sound.
This was a very great moment. Okay, so now for those who are here in the room, there is time for a coffee break. And so we want, before, thank you again, Professor Forrester, for being here, and we invite you to be present next time. Thank you too.
Thank you.
Alle 4:10, ok. Sì, se è possibile rientrare in aula alle 4:10 per continuare i lavori per la prossima sessione. Grazie a tutti.